The TV show BoJack Horseman is mostly well known for having dark humor and a lot of satirical takes on fame and on Hollywood, but one episode in particular really stands out. Season 4, Episode 11, Time's Arrow, takes a much more serious approach than other episodes. Time's Arrow is the best episode of BoJack Horseman, and here's why. Through its amazing writing, this episode sheds light on the important issue of generational trauma. It also explores how the way women have been treated in the past affects the trauma that gets passed down from one generation to the next. I mean, who would have thought that society hating women for hundreds of years would actually affect anyone? But seriously, there are a lot of harsh truths in this episode. Although this is a fictional TV show, this episode discusses very real issues. This episode breaks boundaries in storytelling to explore themes like trauma, sexism, family, and how the pain of one generation can pass down to the next. This episode begins with BoJack driving his mother Beatrice to a caretaking facility because she has severe dementia. Right away, it is clear that she is confused and disoriented because she keeps calling BoJack a different name. She keeps calling him Henrietta. She cannot even recognize BoJack as her son. Then, when she looks in the car's rearview mirror, she does not see her real reflection, but instead, she sees a much younger version of herself. These two displays of her confusion are the beginning of this episode pulling us into the disoriented perspective of Beatrice. As the episode moves along, it brings us through Beatrice's flashbacks. These flashbacks show us the traumatic events that have shaped Beatrice's character. We see that her childhood was filled with many emotional wounds. As the episode begins to move through Beatrice's memories, we begin to see the lasting harm caused by the way society treated women during her time growing up. The flashbacks show us moments with her father, Joseph Sugarman. These moments with her father, shown in this episode, give us insight that he is sexist and dismissive of Beatrice's intellectual pursuits. We can see that he is trying to get her to conform to what he wants her to be, instead of loving who she actually is. But don't be fooled. Joseph is no monster. His behaviors are deeply rooted in the societal norms of the 1940s. He does not consciously realize the harm that he is causing. He thinks that Beatrice should not be caught up in intellectual pursuits. He even tells Beatrice, "Stop making books your friend. Reading does nothing for young women but build their brains." Whoa, books build women's brains? Yeah, I thought that was the whole point, Joseph. Of course, I do not agree with this thought process, but nonetheless, this does reveal just how ingrained his sexist beliefs are. Joseph sees Beatrice as less valuable for pursuing intellectual interest, when it should really be the opposite. The mindset of her father not only affects her, but also goes on to affect her marriage with her husband Butterscotch, and her parenting towards BoJack. Due to her father's sexism and implementation of toxic gender norms, she ditched the life that she really wanted and conformed to the gender norms that her father had ingrained in her. Further in the episode, her flashbacks reveal how she met her husband Butterscotch. They met at Beatrice's debutante. Beatrice did not want to have a debutante ball, but her dad insisted. When she met Butterscotch at the debutante ball, you can tell that she was intrigued with him immediately, because he seemed different than everyone else there. He was very edgy and down to earth, and Beatrice really seemed to like this because they ended up leaving and having a lot of fun that night. If you know what I mean. But unfortunately, her actions did have consequences, and she became pregnant with his child. She ended up deciding to ditch her intellectual pursuits and keep the child. She completely conformed to a life that she did not want at all because of her father's views of her worth as a woman. She goes on to be a very bad mother to BoJack, and she has a very unhealthy marriage with Butterscotch. As this episode progresses into the story of how BoJack came to be, you can start seeing how it is an incredible depiction of how generational trauma works. This episode clearly shows how the trauma of one generation doesn't just fade away, it goes on to affect the next generation. A wise psychiatrist, Carl Jung, once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." This statement is very evident in this episode. For example, Joseph never resolved his trauma, and it ended up traumatizing Beatrice, who then also never resolved her trauma, which then ended up traumatizing BoJack. Although this TV show is fictional, the depiction of this dangerous cycle is very real. For instance, The Harvard Center on the Developing Child states that as young children develop, their emotional experiences literally become embedded in the architecture of their brains. This quote gives us context as to how the trauma is passed down. It becomes part of their brain chemistry. For example, Beatrice's obsession with her beauty and weight was embedded in her brain when she was very young because she got bullied. She never resolved her internalized obsession with beauty, and she passed it down to Bojack. When a parent is emotionally unavailable or abusive, the child learns to seek out validation and love in unhealthy ways, often repeating the same cycles of hurt in future relationships. For instance, Bojack and Beatrice's need for validation and deep-rooted insecurities reflect the emotional neglect they both experienced as a child. Like Beatrice, Bojack's unresolved problems, too, will be passed on to other people. Generational trauma is like a ripple in a pond. One act of pain spreads outward, touching lives in ways we might not even realize. Take Joseph Sugarman, for example. His arrogance caused him to make many mistakes in raising Beatrice, which then led Beatrice to live a life she did not even want. This alone is heartbreaking, but the events that occurred because of Beatrice's deep regret of her life were even worse. At the end of this episode, in the last flashback that Beatrice has, we discover a tragic story. In the beginning of the episode, and in previous episodes, Beatrice repeatedly calls Bojack Henrietta. At the end of this episode, we discover that Henrietta was the maid of the Horseman family. The flashbacks reveal how Beatrice often mistreated Henrietta and was very harsh with her. It is revealed that Henrietta had an affair with Butterscotch Horseman. However, Beatrice did not resent Henrietta for the affair, as her marriage had already fallen apart. I guess Beatrice was just as surprised about Butterscotch cheating on her as we were. She instead resented Henrietta's youth and dreams because it reminded her of the life that she wished she had. Beatrice learned about Henrietta's pregnancy with Butterscotch and immediately urged Henrietta to give up the baby for adoption and focus on her future, projecting her own regrets about Bojack onto Henrietta. Beatrice even offered to pay for Henrietta's education. Henrietta did not want to give up the baby at all, but Beatrice could not see this because she was completely blinded by her own regrets of the past. She tells Henrietta, "Don't throw away your dreams for this child, and don't let that man poison your life the way he did mine." After Beatrice tries to convince Henrietta to give away her child, it cuts to a scene of them in the hospital where Henrietta is giving birth to Bojack's half-sister, Hollyhock. After the baby was born, Beatrice forced Henrietta to give the baby up for adoption and would not even let her hold the baby after birthing it. This act was indubitably cruel, but the intentions were to protect her. Because of her trauma, Beatrice could not see the cruel nature of what she was doing. This tragic event is an example of how generational trauma deeply affects families and other individuals tied to the family. Beatrice's repressed trauma led her to inflict the same pain on others and cause horrible things like this to occur. The ultimate takeaway of Time's Arrow is that it is a profound exploration of how trauma gets passed down through generations and deeply affects individuals and relationships. Through Beatrice's fragmented memories, we see how unresolved pain, societal pressures, and toxic family dynamics create a ripple effect, harming not only her, but the people around her. This episode illustrates how unresolved trauma cannot simply disappear. It always gets passed down if not resolved. Tying this fictional story to real-life problems shows us how dangerous the effects of generational trauma can be. Time's Arrow is the best episode of BoJack Horseman because of its perfect yet heartbreaking depiction of generational trauma. Or maybe the real takeaway here is that animated horses really need therapy. Who knows?